What's the scariest 100% true story you've heard of? Story 1. One of my friend's family growing up had a beach house, and I would get invited every now and then. They had money and the house was massive, a pretty cool place too, and they even had a full-time maid who had her own flat at the back. One day they went there for a long weekend, and when they opened the door, the place had been ransacked. It was all a mess with missing televisions, furniture, broken things. You get the picture. They went to check on the maid and her flat was empty. All her belongings were gone. They called the police who came over and had a brief look, not very interested from what they said, and left saying the maid probably had something to do with it. And that is what everyone believed for about a week. Until the father returned the following weekend to try and change the locks and brought their dogs along with him. And yes, you know it, one of the dogs started digging and found the maid buried in the backyard under a tarp they had close to the pool. So the theory now is that whoever came in probably knew her, and she recognized them, and she had to go. Story 2. My high school girlfriend called late one night after I was home and in bed and said that something had happened and asked if I could come over. She was clearly shaken and not full of details, so I told my parents and drove toward her house. At the top of her subdivision, I was met by a police officer with the lights on. He asked where I was going, and I told him about the call from my girlfriend. He let me go by, and I came over the hill to the cul-de-sac where she lived and saw multiple police cars around the circle. They watched me pull up and get out of my car, and my girlfriend came running out of her house and met me in the street. She explained that someone had broken into her neighbor's house and started beating her with something heavy. The neighbor managed to get out of the house and headed to my girlfriend's house, where she started banging furiously on the front door. My girlfriend's father was out of town, so her mother answered the door, and the neighbor fell into the foyer, bleeding profusely from the head. Her mother looked up to see the attacker heading up the walkway toward the front door. She pulled the neighbor into the house and closed the door, hitting the attacker with it before it fully closed. He then took the heavy tool he had used to beat the neighbor and smashed the small window at the top of the door. Her mother started screaming, and the attacker turned around and walked up the street into the darkness. I spent the night there that night, along with 2 or 3 police officers outside in their cars, and in the morning we could still see blood pooled on the floor in the foyer and splattered above the front door from where the attacker had swung the bloody tool to smash the window. No one was ever caught or even identified. It was completely random. The neighbor survived and to my knowledge had no permanent physical injuries beyond scarring from having her scalp stapled shut, and she moved away shortly after the incident. Story 3. I worked the midnight shift at a gas station, and I have for quite a while at various stations in different areas with varying levels of criminal activity. I have regular customers, of course, and I am a small-statured woman, as is my partner the other half of the week, and we have always been partners, so these regulars often worry about us and keep watch on creepy occurrences when they can. I had one man who worked in the metro about an hour away who would stop in every morning for his cigarettes. He never smiled or seemed friendly, and as I often do, I tried to think of what I could do that might make him smile one day. It took many months, but I finally pulled it off by having his cigarettes ready on the counter and already scanned for him to pay for as he walked in. He smiled and then asked me if I ever got scared on the night shift, saying that for a small girl it was not safe. I said I sometimes did, but we could lock the doors and hide if we had to, and that the provincial police, similar to state troopers if you are American, had a station close by and came in often to get their highway vehicles washed, and I had a good rapport with those officers. He nodded and then told me a story about when he first moved to our country from Eastern Europe with his wife and child back in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He fell asleep at work one night at the gas station where he worked midnights. And when he woke up, the phone had been ringing for hours and his manager was shaking him violently, asking if he was all right. He said he was fine and asked what the problem was, apologizing for falling asleep. His manager screamed that it was fine he fell asleep and told him to look outside because all of their motor oil was missing and the outside of the place was a mess. The thieves had come and taken all the oil and left him alone because he slept through the entire thing, then moved down the road to the next station for an encore. And at that station, the clerk was awake and fought back, so the thieves stabbed him to death and left him to bleed out. When he finished telling me this, he concluded by saying that if I ever felt sleepy, I should just lock the door and do it because it might save my life. I do not work at that station anymore, but I think about that man all the time and wonder how his grandkids are. Story 4. I was around 10 years old and at school when my mother told me she was thinking of taking me to the doctor in the afternoon for a recurring eye issue. At lunchtime, I was in the dining hall when the office woman told me there was a taxi outside for me and that I needed to go, and I assumed my mother booked it for me because she cannot drive. So I cleared up my things and got my bag. I was just about to leave when I remembered my jacket in my classroom. So I rushed to get it and headed out for the taxi. But the office woman told me I was too late and that the taxi had gone without me. I went back to class panicking that my mother would be angry at me. When school finished, my mother was waiting for me at the gates, and I burst into tears apologizing for missing the taxi and thinking I was in big trouble. But she said she never ordered a taxi and had no idea what I was talking about, and she ended up not making the doctor appointment. No one ever found out who ordered the taxi or who the driver was, and my mother does not like to think about what would have happened if I had not forgotten my jacket and gotten into that taxi. Story 5. When I was a little kid, around 5 to 6 years old, we had a neighbor who was like a grandmother to me, and I would go over and have snacks, and she had a Mr. Potato Head that I played with, which had been her now adult son's toy. Weird core memories. He came home in his 20s from the army, I think, and I do not remember much about him, but he asked about taking my older brothers camping, and my mother said no because she had a strange feeling about him. As a side note, we lived out in the country, not even a town, just a place. There were no locked doors and everyone trusted each other. My mother later saw him at our small store with bee stings all over him and was concerned. And he said he got them at the creek, which she thought was strange because that was just not a thing where we went all the time. But she let it go. A little while later, not sure how long, the news reported a murder of some campers out past where we lived with no leads, and people were shocked because this did not happen there. And my mother remembered her strange feeling and the bee stings that did not make sense. She called the police to say it was probably nothing but shared what she knew. And I remember detectives coming to our house to talk to her. They had some other evidence that matched, but not enough to link him to the murder of a couple with their child. And it is unsolved to this day, though the detective said he knew it was him. A few years later, the man went to prison for an abduction and attempted murder of a woman who ran out of gas, and he offered her a ride, and she survived, thankfully. Story 6. My grandfather's village was razed by the Nazis. He had 9 siblings. The Nazis came to the village in retribution due to guerrilla attacks and because they believed the guerrillas were hiding there. Most young men fled before they arrived. The men who were still in the village were lined up against a wall and shot. My grandfather's mother put half of her children, the youngest ones, in the cellar and took the other half with her because the Nazis were rounding up the entire village and locking everyone inside the church. The reason she split her children was because she feared they would all be killed, so she wanted at least some of them to survive. The Nazis ransacked and burned nearly every house in the village, including my grandfather's. He was in the cellar with his siblings and their house burned above them, but they were saved. Those locked in the church also survived, but many others did not. Sometime after this, the Nazis came again and essentially forced all the young men and boys, including my grandfather, to help build roads and fortifications for them. Despite everything, they all survived the war, though many people in the family did not. Story 7. In the 1990s, a nurse in New Jersey killed hundreds of hospital patients. Sometimes he would sneak into patients' rooms at night and inject them with fatal doses of medication. Other times he would put the medication into intravenous bags in the supply room, so they would later kill whichever random patient they were given to. He was accused several times. Some patients pointed him out before they died, and some staff thought he was disturbing and dangerous and refused to work with him. He kept getting fired from hospitals, but hospital administrators knew that if he was arrested, they could be sued by the families of the patients he murdered. So they simply fired him and did not contact the police. This happened at 12 different hospitals over the course of 16 years, and investigators believe he killed as many as 400 people. After he was arrested, he confessed to 40 murders, and in 29 of them, he gave enough detail to be charged and plead guilty. He is linked to more than 300 additional deaths beyond that. But the details of those cases will likely never be known because so much information was lost over time or destroyed by the hospitals. Story 8. To this day, I am still looking for a logical explanation for this. This happened in 2003. An ex and I were checked into a coastal resort where the cottages were far apart, around 200 meters from each other. Around 11 to 11:30 at night, while we were both drinking beer with the lights turned off and only the television on, the doorknob suddenly rattled violently, like someone was forcefully trying to get it open. There was no secondary lock on the door, so my first reaction was to jump from the bed and block the door with my weight. The force of my landing must have been heard from the other side, but the twisting of the doorknob continued. By that point, I was pressing my face to the floor, trying to estimate how many people were outside by looking through the small gap between the floor and the bottom of the door. There was nothing. Not a single pair of feet or anything at all, but the doorknob just kept rattling. I should point out that the gap between the floor and the door was enough for me to see outside, or at the very least notice any change in shadow or light caused by movement, but there was nothing. The turning of the doorknob eventually stopped, but I never heard any footsteps or any other sound. We waited a few minutes and then opened the door, and everything was quiet with no footprints outside or in the sand surrounding the cottage. We left immediately. Story 9. When I was 17, I was hanging out with two friends, and they wanted to go smoke weed in the woods. I did not feel like it, so I drove them there and waited in the car. After a while, I got bored and decided to go meet them, but there were 4 paths going off in different directions, so I just took the largest one. After walking for a few minutes in the pitch-black forest, this was before flashlights on phones, I came across a dip in the trail, and on the other side there was a bench faintly visible in the moonlight. Sitting on the bench was a man, and another man was standing in front of him, but I could only make out silhouettes. Thinking they were my friends, I yelled out to them before walking closer. If you have ever walked through the woods at night, you know there is an uneasy feeling all around, so I was cautious to begin with. Immediately after I yelled out, both silhouettes turned toward me, and without a word or sound, the man who had been sitting down started sprinting toward me at full speed in complete silence. I ran the other way as fast as I could, tripping over things because I could not see anything. I finally got back to my car and locked myself inside, but I was terrified for my friends. About a minute later, I saw them both coming out from a completely different path, and they confirmed they never saw me or anyone else. My heart still sinks when I think about that man sprinting toward me in silence. Story. 230 years ago, I remember sneaking out of my friend's house at night to do nothing more than walk around the neighborhood and hide from car headlights. We were young and bored. There was a homeless camp down in some woods off the railroad tracks not too far from his house, and we had seen the trail and knew what was back there. One of the homeless men who lived there was actually an old friend of my buddy's father, and he had stopped by a few times, with my friend's father letting him shower there and everything. He could have worked if he wanted to, but he openly told us he just liked living off the grid, so I wanted to give some backstory on why we thought it would be cool and safe to check it out at night. We were a bit nervous at first, thinking about what if we got there and his father's friend was not there, so we started sneaking up on it. It was a longer walk than we expected, and when we got kind of close, we saw a fire lighting up the woods a bit. We moved closer, but the trail continued straight while the camp was set off the trail to the left. We got maybe 100 feet from the camp, around 30 meters, and looked down the trail where we saw a faint silhouette of what we thought was a person coming from deeper in the woods toward the camp. We froze and ducked slightly off the side of the trail. I told my friend I did not like it and that we should sneak out immediately, and he said he had the same feeling. The fire was just bright enough to light the area so we could see. We slowly crept off the trail back toward the railroad tracks, and after about 30 to 40 feet, around 9 to 12 meters, I told him I would rather get back on the trail and walk slowly so we could actually see something coming and run if we had to. We both played football and were fast. We stepped out of the brush and saw the silhouette was closer, and even though the light was dimmer away from the fire, we could still tell someone or something was moving toward us. My first thought was that they saw us duck into the bushes and were coming to check, but it felt wrong. My friend and I looked at each other and silently decided to pick up the pace. Almost on cue, we looked back, and the silhouette was sprinting toward us at full speed. Completely silent. No noise at all, just fast movement. We ran as hard as we could. Thankfully, the trail was wide, so we did not bump into each other, and neither of us looked back until we reached the railroad tracks and crossed the bridge to the other side. I looked back while slowing down past the bridge and did not see anyone. We got back to his house quickly, and that was the end of it. Story 11. The legend of Bearman is often compared to that one South Park episode with a half-bear creature, but it was nothing like that. There was a summer camp I used to attend with around 500 kids staying for a full week. Everyone was assigned cabins based on age and gender, with an older teen, usually around 17 or 18 years old, supervising kids between 13 and 16. The adult staff had their own cabins and took turns on night shift, walking around to make sure everyone stayed in their cabins. With that setting in mind, the legend went like this. Once all the kids were inside their cabins and the lights were out, a bear would come out of the deep woods and wander into the campgrounds. The bear would stand on its back legs and walk like a human, then choose a cabin, and if you were unlucky, it would stand by your bed and watch you sleep. If you moved even once, it would grab you and take you into the woods, never to be seen again. Hearing this terrified 14-year-old me, it was something an older girl told us, and while some girls brushed it off as a trick to make us stay quiet, kids from other cabins had heard it too. I never stopped thinking about it and would lie completely still when I slept. Years later, I ran into one of the former camp staff and mentioned how scared I had been of Bearman, assuming it was just a scare tactic. They told me it was actually based on a real incident, explaining that back in the 1980s, a man dressed in a bear costume, which was a mascot for the camp at the time, would sneak into cabins and take girls out. Finding out Bearman had actually existed at one point completely horrified me. Story 12. The other night, my wife took our child out for several hours, and during that time, I wrapped up work and then left to get dinner around 4:30 in the afternoon. I got home around 6:30, played with our dog, and did a few chores. Then when my wife got home around 7:30, we relaxed a bit, and I headed to bed around 9 in the evening, since I am usually up early with our child. Maybe 2 minutes after crawling into bed, I got a text from my wife with a picture of our dry erase menu board on the fridge. Usually at the start of the week, my wife fills out a rough menu for dinners, and I clearly remembered seeing it earlier that day filled out normally. The picture she sent showed the menu completely scrambled, with letters moved all over, random words and strange squiggles everywhere. Some of it was clearly her writing, but other parts were incomplete words or rewritten words in handwriting that was not hers or mine. This freaked us out because our 1-year-old absolutely could not have done it. The county sheriff came out and searched the house, but found nothing, and nothing was missing or out of place. He was a little shaken too, and said they almost never get calls out in the country where we live. And he recommended changing the locks since we had never done that after buying the house from an elderly couple. We changed the locks that same night. Story 13. When I was about 18, my friend and I went to the movies and then decided to walk home because it was a bit of a walk, but we did not want to pay for a cab. I am always pretty vigilant when walking, especially at night, so I noticed a guy with his hood up walking behind us. Every so often, I looked over my shoulder to check on him. He started far behind us but was gaining ground strangely fast. The last time I turned my head, I caught him sprinting toward us. I panicked and told my friend to run. She was wearing those Birkenstock slip-on sandals that were popular at the time and was struggling to run, so I was basically dragging her until we reached a gas station. I banged on the window and begged the clerk to let us in, but he said he could not because it was past a certain time at night, though he promised that if the guy came near us, he would call the police. The guy came down the hill and walked through the gas station, staring at us the entire time. I truly believe the only reason he did not do anything was because the clerk had the phone visibly in his hand, and he was a large man. I completely broke down after the guy left. The thought that he had been running at us while my back was turned still terrifies me. I cannot stop thinking about what would have happened if I had not turned around that last time. Story 14. One of my experiences with night terrors and sleep paralysis left me with memory loss and the unsettling realization that my body functioned without me for an entire week. I was about 7 years old when I woke in the middle of the night and saw a smoke-like creature crawling up the bottom of my bed. It was terrifying, and I ran for the landing, which is strange because, looking back, I would have expected it to be sleep paralysis, something I still experience often, but this time I could move perfectly. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw another one, slowly climbing up, step by step, out of the darkness below. I froze and looked around for somewhere else to run, but I was trapped because the first one was coming through my bedroom doorway toward me. Both of these smoke-like figures were advancing on 7-year-old me, so I did the only thing I could think of and screamed as loud as I could. My mom came running just as my vision started to fade with smoke creeping in, similar to what I experience when I stand up too fast. She calmed me down, took me back to bed, and at some point left and let me fall asleep again. The next morning I apologized for waking her up the night before, but she had no idea what I meant. When I explained it, she told me it had happened over a week earlier, not the previous night. I have absolutely no memory of that entire week, yet apparently I went to school every day, played with friends, ate dinner, did homework, and took baths as normal. My mom said I was quieter than usual, and she assumed I was having trouble at school, which was not uncommon for me. To this day, I remember nothing after that night, and it still unsettles me to think that my body continued living daily life without my awareness. Story 15. I lived in Mesa, Arizona when I was 10 years old in a rough area, but I was just a kid and completely unaware of the dangers of the world. I was walking home from a friend's house one evening, and my mother wanted me home by 9, so I always started walking back around 8:40 to make sure I was not late. It was only a few blocks, so it was not far, but it was the time of year when the sun set around 5:30 and it was fully dark, well before 7. As I was walking, I heard a woman calling my name. I turned and saw it was one of my mother's acquaintances, someone familiar but not close. I said hello and smiled. She walked up and told me my mother had called her and asked her to give me a ride home because something had happened at my house, and it was an emergency, saying I needed to go with her and her husband, who my family also knew. I was only about 5 minutes from home, but I agreed. As we walked, I felt a deep sense of dread in my stomach, and my legs started shaking, something I now recognize as my instincts going into high alert. I stopped and asked if we could call my mother, and the woman said my mother was in the hospital and that we needed to hurry. Just as we were opening the car door, I heard my mother scream my name at the top of her lungs. I turned instantly and walked back to her. My mother asked what was going on, and the woman claimed she was just offering me a ride. I told my mother exactly what she had said to me, and my mother immediately knew I was telling the truth. When the woman tried to interrupt, my mother cut her off and said in a shocked voice that still gives me chills that she was trying to take her son. The husband urged his wife to get in the car, and as I glanced toward him, I saw a syringe on the dashboard that he grabbed quickly. They drove off, and my mother burst into tears, saying she almost lost me. Later, we learned the man was arrested months later for horrific crimes, and police found restraints, dangerous substances, and even photos of me saved from my mother's social media, suggesting I had been watched. To this day, I struggle to talk about it, knowing that if I had not paused for those few seconds to ask to call my mother, my life might have ended or been forever changed. That night taught me to trust my instincts, and it remains the most terrifying experience of my life. Story 16. Back when I had just been enrolled in school as a child, all the way until we reached Standard 4, our school had a music teacher who was a wonderful woman with a pleasant, calming, and soothing demeanor and voice. She was an exceptional music teacher, and because of her, I developed a deep passion for music from a very young age. She was in her 40s and appeared to be single, which was notable because, in my country, women are still shamed and looked down upon if they choose to remain unmarried after their 30s. Most of our teachers were married and often talked about their families, sometimes even trying to convince single teachers to find someone, something I now experience myself after reaching my 30s. Because of this, several teachers tried to set her up, until one day she calmly said that she was married to her music and to God. The other teachers murmured among themselves, but never brought it up again, at least not in front of us students. She had a warm and comforting smile, a very pleasant voice, and a soft tone, but she was a woman of few words who preferred to mind her own business. She spent most of her day in the music room practicing, between classes, or sitting at the piano in the auditorium. I did occasionally see her speaking with other faculty members, but she never spent as much time with them as they did with one another. She rarely spoke unless it was about music classes or practice sessions. She dressed uniquely, usually wearing an A-line skirt pulled high above the waist, paired with a tucked-in long-sleeve shirt and a sleeveless overcoat, with variations of this outfit every day. She had very curly hair cut into a bob and wore thick black framed glasses. There was nothing particularly strange or alarming about her, just something quietly unique, especially since most of our teachers wore traditional clothing and were very involved, sometimes overly involved, with students and school activities. She left the school when I was in fifth standard, and we gave her a warm farewell. I remember feeling genuinely sad when she left. Many years later, when I was living in another city and entering my second year of university, I read a bizarre news article one morning that was breaking in my hometown and quickly gaining national attention. It was one of the strangest and most disturbing true crime stories I had ever encountered, made even more unsettling by the fact that it happened where I grew up. A father had set himself on fire in the bathroom of an old house in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. His son was reportedly unaware and appeared deeply disturbed. As police investigated further, they discovered 4 additional bodies inside the house. In one room, carefully boarded and sealed, lay the decomposed remains of a daughter or sister placed neatly on a bed, with fresh food served, incense burning, music playing, and 2 dogs positioned on either side of her. The brother had been living in the house with her remains for a very long time. Further investigation revealed that the brother was mentally unstable and that the family communicated only through written notes filled with eerie and unsettling messages. His journal detailed severe mental deterioration, along with dark, abusive, and deeply dysfunctional family dynamics, including disturbing religious practices and other horrifying implications. It was a tragic and deeply unsettling case. What stopped me cold was the name of the woman whose remains were found, because it sounded painfully familiar. I searched further and found another article with a photograph of the deceased. To my complete shock and disbelief, it was my first school music teacher. This was her home, her life, and her death, none of which I had ever known about. Many details were never fully revealed, and rumors spread wildly, but the available information pointed to severe mental illness and tragedy. I felt overwhelming sadness and disbelief. She had taught us beautiful music and wonderful songs, and had always seemed so kind and wholesome, and this was how her life ended. 2 years later, the brother also took his own life. I still remember her sitting at the piano, smiling warmly at my younger self and softly saying, "Good." I often wish that someone had been able to help her while there was still time. Story 17. My grandpa and his hunting buddy were out moose hunting many years ago, back when my mother was still a child. They had been hiking for about an hour, looking for a large bull, when they decided to split up to cover more ground. After about 15 to 20 minutes of walking through dense brush, my grandpa stepped into a small clearing and suddenly found himself face to face with a mother grizzly bear and her 2 cubs. Almost instinctively, he scrambled up the nearest tree, just barely out of the angry mother bear's reach, even kicking at her snout a few times as she lunged. After circling the tree, scratching at the bark, and growling, the bear eventually ambled off into the brush with her cubs following behind. Thinking he was safe, my grandpa started climbing down, but the sound of crashing branches from the same bushes the bear had disappeared into sent him straight back up the tree. She must have seen him trying to descend, because she charged back again, snapping furiously at his feet and violently shaking the tree. Once more, after circling, growling, and clawing, she left. This time my grandpa waited longer before attempting to climb down. He carefully descended and began moving quickly but quietly in the direction where he and his friend had parked their truck. The bear had clearly been watching him, because just as he was nearly out of the clearing, she charged out once again. He immediately climbed another tree, higher than before, and endured a long stretch of snarling, shaking, scratching, and sheer terror as the bear tried to reach him. Eventually she left again, this time more abruptly. My grandpa stayed in that tree for what felt like forever, listening intently for any movement, and after about half an hour he slowly climbed down, stopping repeatedly to make sure the bear was not waiting nearby. Once he reached the ground and felt it was clear, he made a quiet but fast escape back to the truck, where his hunting buddy was waiting, also empty-handed. When asked why he did not bring anything back, my grandpa simply said he had an encounter with the most persistent mother bear in the world, and that explanation was more than enough. Story 18. My partner and I were flying into her hometown after traveling around the country for Thanksgiving, arriving a few days earlier than planned without telling any family on either side, since we had spent Thanksgiving together for several years already. This was back in 1992, so there were no mobile phones, no tracking, and no easy way for anyone to know where we were. We arrived late at night, somewhere around 11 in the evening to midnight, and decided to stay at a hotel because while surprising family late at night would have been memorable, it was not the kind of surprise we wanted. Our room was an extended stay setup with a kitchenette, couch, television, and a large bed, one of the nicer places we had stayed. I fell asleep almost immediately while she took a shower and later told me she did not fall asleep until around 2 in the morning. The room had a sliding glass door next to the bed that led directly to the parking lot and a smaller window near the front door. The blinds on the sliding door were closed, but the smaller window was slightly open, and although she noticed it, she was too tired to care, assuming no one could see in since the room was dark. As she turned over to sleep around 2 in the morning, she saw a brief flash through the partially open blinds, like a camera flash, but because the parking lot was some distance away, she assumed it was a street light and fell asleep. Around 5 in the morning, I was jolted awake by loud, persistent knocking on the sliding glass door. She woke up moments later, just as confused as I was. The knocking did not stop, forceful and deliberate, then briefly paused before starting again at the front door. It was not quite a police knock, but it was clear whoever was outside wanted in. I checked the peephole and saw no one. The knocking resumed at the sliding glass door, and what bothered me most was the silence. No voice, no explanation, no name being called. I stood by the sliding door and waited until the knocking stopped, then pulled the curtain back slightly. Without my glasses or contact lenses, I had to press my face close to the glass, and I still saw no one. The moment I closed the blinds, the knocking started again. At that point, fear set in. No one knew we were there except the older man who checked us in, and there was no reason for anyone to be playing a prank. I worried about our safety, knowing I was not physically imposing and would not stand much of a chance if someone forced their way in. I called the front desk, and the same man answered, sounding surprised to hear from me. I explained what was happening while the knocking continued, and he said he would send security immediately. The knocking went on for another minute or so before stopping. Shortly after, the front desk called back to say security found no one and no signs of anyone being there, offering a vague apology. Neither of us slept again until daylight. Later that day, we noticed a single footprint leading away from the sliding glass door, which made everything even more unsettling, given how safe and familiar the area was to her. To this day, we still have no explanation, and even now, thinking about it leaves me deeply uneasy. Story 19. Twice in my life, I have encountered something I cannot identify, something that has since been described to me by others as a Wendigo. The first time I was backcountry camping, not extremely far out, but far enough off the beaten path that I knew there were no other people within 5 kilometers. For clarity, I was sober, not overly tired, and clear-headed. And if this had only happened once, I would have dismissed it as a dream or a faulty memory. Late at night, I got thirsty, emptied my water bottle, and decided to walk down to the nearby river to refill it so the purification tablets could work overnight and I would have water in the morning. It was maybe a 5-minute walk from my camp. Down by the river, lit only by moonlight, I saw an animal. My flashlight was pointed at my feet so I would not trip. It had 4 legs and appeared dark, almost black. I immediately started going through possibilities in my head. It was far too thin to be a black bear, and nothing else fit. Then it stood up. The only way I can describe it is like a muscular coyote with no fur, black skin, extremely long arms, and based on the nearby trees, around 7 feet tall. It looked directly at me and I stared back. I knew instantly it was not a coyote and not a bear, and I had no intention of finding out what it actually was in the middle of the night. I kept my eyes on it, backed away slowly until I was out of its line of sight, returned to my camp, packed my things, and left immediately. Years later, about 1,000 kilometers away, I had a second encounter. Late at night, I was walking down a dirt service road near a farm when a head suddenly rose out of the wheat and looked in my direction. I instantly recognized the shape. At first, it did not seem focused on me, so I said out loud that I was just passing through and going the other way. It turned and looked directly at me, then slowly lowered back into the wheat. I left immediately. I do not know what I saw, and it does not match any animal I have ever encountered. I have since spoken to others who suggested it was a wolf or coyote with mange, but that explanation does not fit. The ears were wrong, the arms were far too long, and the way it stood was unlike anything natural I know. I do not claim it was supernatural or an undiscovered creature, but I no longer walk in moonlight while backcountry camping in the Rockies. Story 20. My personal scariest experience happened in 2013. I was driving at midnight about 40 to 50 feet behind a red truck while heading home from my girlfriend's house. We were on a long bridge that peaked in the middle, about 3/4 of a mile on each side, with straight open roads continuing for another mile in both directions, and no side roads branching off. From the center of the bridge, you can normally see close to 2 miles ahead. I was just driving along listening to music when, right before the red truck reached the peak, I felt a sudden and intense drop in my stomach, like the sensation you get on a roller coaster. The truck crested the bridge, and from my position, I could not see beyond the peak until I reached it myself. About 4 to 5 seconds later, I reached the top, and the truck was completely gone. I looked down the entire stretch of road, and there was not a single vehicle in sight. Even if it had been the fastest car imaginable, there was no way it could have disappeared that quickly. I later tried looking up whether a red truck had ever driven off that bridge, but I never found anything. To this day, I cannot explain it, but I can still clearly picture that red Ford Ranger. Story 21. About 5 years ago, my husband and I stayed at a very nice resort in Mexico, a place we had visited several times before without any issues. One afternoon, we were relaxing on the beach at the resort, with me lying in a hammock wearing a white bikini while my husband wandered nearby. A well-dressed older man came over from the bar and started casually chatting with me, asking how I was enjoying the trip, whether we were staying at the resort, and who we were traveling with. It felt like harmless conversation, and at the time I did not realize he was gathering information. My husband eventually joined us, and the man went back to the bar. I do not drink, but my husband does, and that afternoon he had several drinks. He is a large man and an experienced drinker, but after a couple of hours and a few drinks, he was barely coherent. I had to help him back to our room, where he immediately undressed, collapsed onto the bed, and passed out. I lay beside him to make sure he was breathing normally and did not get sick. About 30 minutes later, there was a knock at our hotel room door. Because my husband was naked and unconscious, I chose not to answer. Moments later, I heard what sounded like a key card, and 3 men entered our room. I was completely stunned and had no idea what was happening. I sat up and asked if everything was okay. They stood there staring at me for several long seconds while I stared back, shocked that they did not immediately leave, despite my husband lying exposed on the bed. Finally, one of them asked if there was a problem with the bathroom, and I replied that everything was fine. Only then did they back out and leave. I later realized that the plan had likely been for both of us to be incapacitated, but because I had not been drinking, I was awake. My husband woke up hours later with no memory of what had happened. Story 22. I was out in California with my wife and our daughter, who was about 10 months old at the time, visiting my father-in-law. We drove into the city to spend some time together, and he needed to deal with a traffic ticket, so we went to the courthouse. As we pulled in, we saw a car entering the lot through a gate with an attendant. Not extremely fast, but far too fast for a parking lot. The attendant appeared to be running after the car, which immediately confused us. The car continued into the lot, picked up even more speed, and suddenly the passenger, a woman, opened the door and fell out of the moving vehicle. We stopped our car just outside the lot, trying to process what we were seeing. The car came to a stop. The driver jumped out and started chasing the woman. Chaos erupted instantly. She was screaming. He was chasing her. The lot attendant was close behind. And then I noticed the driver was holding a knife. The woman ran toward the courthouse steps as the driver caught up to her. Courthouse police rushed in, 3 officers with guns drawn, shouting for them to stop. The driver tackled the woman, still holding the knife, and as they struggled on the ground, we heard 4 to 5 gunshots. I was certain both of them had just been killed, but the woman suddenly jumped up and was quickly pulled into the courthouse by one of the officers. The other 2 approached the man with their guns still raised as he writhed briefly and then went still. My wife initially thought the shots might have been beanbags or something similar. Thankfully, our daughter was in a rear-facing car seat and completely unaware of what was happening. We turned around and left immediately. Later news reports explained that the woman had been physically abused by the man and convinced him to take her to the courthouse under the excuse of dealing with a ticket. She took her chance to escape, he chased her with a knife, and the courthouse police shot and killed him. It still feels unreal that I witnessed those officers end a man's life, and I am amazed that the woman was not injured despite the chaos. Story 23. I grew up watching scary movies on Sunday mornings after church with my dad, and at night my imagination would run wild with monsters and figures waiting for me to look at them. I kept my eyes shut, trying not to make it obvious, praying silently and singing church songs in my head until I finally fell asleep. During my freshman year of high school, we moved into a newer and larger house, and I remember feeling reassured by the scriptures painted on tiles in the kitchen and bathrooms, convincing myself that a house built by a pastor could not possibly be cursed or tied to anything dark. All 4 bedrooms shared a hallway, with 3 doors at one end and the master bedroom at the other. One night I woke up and peeked, certain nothing would be there, but in the corner opposite my open door was a shadow darker than the rest of the hallway. I knew it was watching me, and I knew it knew I had seen it. I could make out a tall, slender figure wearing what looked like a top hat. I dove under my covers, eyes clenched shut, praying and singing in my head, refusing to move until I eventually passed out. Decades later, my younger brother and I were reminiscing about our childhood when my husband suggested I tell him about the shadow with the top hat. Before I could say anything else, my brother went pale and described the exact same figure. That realization, knowing he had seen it too, terrified me far more than the original experience ever did. Story 24. A few years ago, I came home to find the front door of my house slightly open. My housemate at the time had a terrible habit of not locking up, so I assumed this was just another example and felt annoyed more than alarmed. The house was very small, with the front door opening directly into the living room, the kitchen immediately to the right, and French doors opposite the front door leading to the back garden. Upstairs, there were only 2 rooms and a bathroom. I went inside and nothing seemed out of place. My housemate's laptop was on the couch. Car keys were on the window ledge, and there was cash and a bank card on the coffee table. So I did not suspect anything. Still, because the door had been open for who knows how long, I went upstairs to check the rooms in case the neighbor's cat had wandered in. While I was upstairs, I suddenly heard someone sprint across the living room and violently fling open the French doors. Without thinking, I ran downstairs and caught a glimpse of a man in the garden jumping over the tall back fence. I locked the doors, calmed myself, and even laughed it off as a near miss with a home intruder. I then went into the kitchen to make tea and froze. Every cupboard and drawer was open, everything had been rummaged through, and all the sharp knives, including the entire knife block, were gone. It took a few moments to sink in that the man who had taken all those knives had been hiding in the kitchen the entire time I was downstairs. The kitchen was barely 10 feet from the front door, and he would have had to run past me to escape. The thought that if I had not gone upstairs to check for the cat, I likely would have come face to face with him in that tiny kitchen still makes my blood run cold. Story 25. I was driving home after visiting a friend who lived several hours away from me, about 6 hours to be exact. I had not seen my friend in a very long time, and instead of leaving early like I should have, I left their place around 8 in the evening. I messaged my husband when I left and told him not to wait up for me because I would not be home until almost 3 in the morning. We said goodnight and he told me to drive safely. The highways I take to get home are not major roads, and since I live in rural Canada, most of the drive is on small 2-lane highways through beautiful countryside. About 4 hours into the drive, things started to get strange. I was in the middle of nowhere when my vehicle GPS began malfunctioning, and after a few minutes it completely shut off. I decided to use my phone instead, but as soon as I loaded the directions, my phone started acting erratically, with the screen flashing on and off and the map spinning uncontrollably, before it also died. I was not too worried at first since I was only a couple of hours from home and knew the general route. I turned on the radio, but instead of the usual faint stations you can normally pick up even that far out, there was only an unsettling static. It was a calm, clear summer night and the stars were incredibly bright. But suddenly a strange green fog began to roll in. As I continued driving, the fog grew so thick that I had to slow down to around 40 kilometers per hour on a highway where I had been driving 120 earlier. Then, without warning, my car died while I was still moving. I drive a manual, so I put it in neutral and coasted as far as I could until I came to a stop. The fog was so dense it seeped into the car, and I could barely see my hands on the steering wheel, with a bitter taste in the air. The next thing I remember, it was daylight, and two workers were yelling at me. I was disoriented and frozen as they demanded to know how my car was parked on private railroad property and how I got past security. I had no answers and no idea where I was. They threatened to call the police for trespassing, and when I tried to explain that my car had died on the highway, I went to start it to prove it, and after hesitating heavily, it started. I was in shock to realize I was inside a Canadian National Rail yard, surrounded by a tall fence and a locked security gate, at least 100 kilometers from where I last remembered being. As I drove out, I panicked thinking about my husband, knowing he must be terrified. My phone was still completely dead, and when I finally made it home, it was 3 in the afternoon. I tried to explain everything to my husband, and neither of us could make sense of it. The next day, I took my phone in for repairs and was told it could be fixed. Soon after, I began feeling extremely ill, with hair falling out and a painful rash developing. At the hospital, staff initially did not believe my story until my blood work came back showing radiation poisoning. I was placed in isolation and spent 21 days in the hospital before being cleared. When I eventually got my phone back, the final GPS ping showed my location as 4,000 feet in the air. Story 26, I worked as a house cleaner in Minneapolis for most of 2019, and one of my regular clients was a mother with two young boys. They lived in an old house that was kept fairly tidy, but every time I cleaned it felt sad and worn down, likely from years of use and the mismatched secondhand furniture that filled the space. The mother was soft-spoken, gentle, and quietly confident, often working from her bedroom while I cleaned, and sometimes leaving me alone in the house. Her boys had colorful bedding and books scattered everywhere, and though I did not interact with them much, they seemed like happy, normal kids with a caring and hardworking parent. During one cleaning, I was organizing papers on a desk in the living room so I could dust, and I noticed documents from her lawyer on top of the pile confirming finalized divorce proceedings. I did not read much, but it was clear she had recently separated from her husband. Later that year, I left the cleaning company, and in the fall of 2020, I moved back to Virginia to live with my parents. That December, I received an email from a massage therapist I used to see in Minneapolis, announcing time off due to a shooting involving someone close to her family, and she included a link to a database of gun violence victims in the Twin Cities. Out of morbid curiosity, I clicked through the list, and after some time I was shocked to see photographs of the woman I had cleaned for and her two sons. I learned that in early December of 2019, her ex-husband came to pick up the boys as usual, but arrived armed. The children ran out excited, realized what was happening, and tried to flee, but he shot both of them in the front yard in broad daylight. He then went inside, shot and stabbed their mother, and took his own life. Although I did not know them personally, it was deeply unsettling to have been so familiar with their home and belongings and then learn of their deaths there. Since then, I have spent a lot of time trying to understand how someone can reach the point of destroying their own family. And I hope that what remains of their loved ones can find some measure of peace after such an unimaginable tragedy. Story 27. I lived in Germany for a couple of years and met several people with remarkable and heartbreaking stories, but two in particular still stay with me. One woman I knew survived Auschwitz. She had been pregnant while still in high school in Berlin, near the end of the war, and her teacher told the class they would periodically be working in a munitions factory as a form of community service. My friend made a joke along the lines of not wanting to make weapons for Hitler, and soon after learned she had been reported to the Gestapo. She fled to relatives near Dresden, where she gave birth to her daughter, and then returned to Berlin so the Gestapo would not find the baby. She was caught, arrested as a political dissident, and sent to Auschwitz. While imprisoned there, she was raped repeatedly by guards and suffered multiple miscarriages. Dr. Josef Mengele performed a hysterectomy on her, which she described as him tearing out her uterus, supposedly to prevent further pregnancies, and then sent her back to the guards for continued abuse. She survived until the liberation of Auschwitz in January 1945, after which she was passed between different Allied forces who did not know what to do with her. She eventually made it back to Berlin but was not reunited with her daughter until the early 1950s, as locating family members after the war was its own nightmare. Another man I knew had served compulsory time as a soldier during the Cold War and was stationed at the Berlin Wall. One night he witnessed a man sprinting across no man's land trying to reach West Berlin. My friend despised the communists and intended to let the man escape, but his commanding officer also saw what was happening. The officer ran up to him and screamed for him to raise his rifle and shoot the fleeing man. When my friend refused to move, the officer pulled out his pistol, pointed it at my friend's head, and threatened to kill him if he did not shoot. My friend, who was barely over 5 feet tall, threw his rifle at the officer and yelled that if he wanted the man dead, he should do it himself. The officer backed down. My friend was punished later, and both he and the man who ran for freedom survived. Story 28. This is not a graphic crime story, but it still makes my mother cry to tell it. And I know it is true because it happened to me. I went to lower school in a very rural town where houses were far apart, and there were no sidewalks at all, and everyone knew our regular school bus driver by name. I started kindergarten at about 5 years old and was a very small child, barely 40 pounds. One winter day, we were taken home by a substitute bus driver who did not know the route. Normally, I was dropped off directly in front of my house, no more than about 50 feet from the door, but that day the substitute missed at least 5 bus stops and finally stopped several miles down the road, ordering about 30 children between the ages of 5 and 10 to get off the bus. Several angry parents had been driving behind the bus and quickly picked up their children where we were dropped off, but I was left there alone, 5 years old in the middle of winter, with my home miles away. One older boy from my school stayed behind with his father until everyone else had left, including the bus. I remember the father saying he could not leave me there, but he seemed nervous and afraid of getting into trouble if he put me in his car. I did not really know his son, only recognized him vaguely from school. Eventually, the father buckled me into the back seat, and his son gave directions to my house. When we arrived, there was more anxious conversation in the driveway, and the man waited until I walked inside before driving away. My parents did not find out what had happened until years later, and my mother has often said that if she had known a 5-year-old had been abandoned on the side of the road in winter, she would have caused a massive uproar. So many terrible things could have happened to me that day, from being hit by a car to freezing or being taken by someone with bad intentions. I have no idea who that man was, but I remain deeply grateful to him and his son. Story 29. One night, a husband and wife were asleep in their first-floor condo when the wife was jolted awake by a noise loud enough to alarm her. At first, she tried to convince herself it was just one of those random sounds, but she stayed perfectly still and listened. It quickly became clear that someone was moving around inside their condo. She shook her husband awake and immediately put her fingers to her lips, whispering that someone was inside. The husband crawled out of bed, went into the living room, and shouted that he knew someone was there and they needed to leave. Instead of running, the intruder rushed him and a violent fight broke out. The husband was strong, with a physically demanding job and powerful hands, but the intruder kept fighting and would not stop. The wife stayed in the bedroom with emergency services on the line. Eventually, the husband managed to get the intruder into a chokehold and could feel his breathing weakening, realizing that if he continued, he would kill him. Not wanting to take a life, he loosened his grip. As soon as the intruder felt air return to his lungs, he reached into his boot, pulled out a knife, and stabbed the husband in the chest. The intruder then ran into the bedroom, grabbed the wife's purse, and fled. The husband staggered back into the bedroom, pale and bleeding heavily as he clutched his chest. Emergency responders arrived quickly and rushed him into surgery, where doctors discovered the knife had punctured his lung and he had nearly died. The question of kill or be killed still haunts me, because this happened to my husband and me. Story 30, I was paddleboarding at the beach in Destin, Florida, about 20 yards from shore. There were lots of kids playing at the water's edge, but not many people in the water because it was a yellow flag day. I was paddling parallel to the shore when I noticed a massive shadow in the water ahead of me. At first I thought it was a large clump of seaweed, but then I realized it was moving in the same direction I was. My thoughts raced from dolphin to shark, but it was far too large to be either. When a wave rolled through and lifted the shadow closer to the surface, I realized with horror that it was a crocodile, not an alligator, which I see often in rivers, but something much larger, easily 3 to 4 times the size of any alligator I had ever seen. My entire body froze, and all I could focus on was not falling into the water. The whole encounter probably lasted only 15 to 20 seconds, but it felt endless. What unsettled me the most was that no one on shore seemed to notice at all. Kids continued playing in the sand, while parents sat under umbrellas scrolling on their phones as this enormous animal swam past. Even now, telling the story gives me an uneasy feeling. I have encountered sharks, bears, wild boar, and venomous snakes, but this was the only experience that truly paralyzed me with fear. Story 31, I had just started college and locked myself out of my car yet again, distracted and careless as usual. I did not want to call my dad, but then realized my phone was also locked inside the car, so I decided to head toward campus to find help. A man sitting in a nearby vehicle noticed me and offered to call someone for me. As he dialed, he stared at me in a way that made my stomach drop, and I suddenly became very aware of the L-shaped parking lot and the fact that I was in the back with only one way out. I saw 2 other men walking toward us and realized the man was actually calling one of them. I nervously joked that it must be the wrong number, and he smirked. My mind was racing at how careless I had been. Then, by pure luck, I saw headlights flashing and recognized my dad's car. He had been trying to call me and guessed I had locked myself out again. I burst into tears. As I moved away, one of the men stepped to block me, but my dad pulled up so close he nearly hit them and loudly began describing them out loud, saying there were 2 Caucasian men wearing blue sweaters and a third man in a truck. They panicked and rushed toward the vehicle, but there was still only one way out. I jumped into my dad's car just as campus officers arrived moments later. A girl who had been with me earlier noticed I was missing and asked the officers to check on me. I do not know what kind of guardian angel situation that was, but I have never felt more grateful. Story 32. My family has always had terrible luck, and I have 2 similar stories that have been passed down. One involves a part of my extended family that included my cousin, his wife, and their 5 daughters, all under the age of 10. The youngest was a newborn, and the second youngest had severe intellectual disabilities caused by complications at birth and was around 2 or 3 years old. My cousin apparently owed a friend money, and this man was well known to the family and frequently visited. The reason for the debt was never confirmed, though it was strongly implied to be related to gambling. One night while my cousin was at work, the friend came to the house. One of the little girls, who was around 4 or 5, answered the door. What followed was horrific. The man attacked the family, and when my cousin returned home, he found his household destroyed, the newborn still in her crib, and the youngest child wandering in shock. The loss devastated the entire family. The second story goes back several generations to my great-grandmother. Her family owned a general store in Missouri, where her parents and siblings all worked together. One day, the family was killed in a violent attack at the store, and my great-grandmother, who was the youngest daughter, was the only survivor. After that, she left Missouri and eventually moved to Oregon to start a new life. The exact details of how she got there were never clearly explained, but those tragedies shaped everything that came after.